Okay, hi everybody. I hope you had a meaningful Tisha B'Av, and may it be our last that we spend on the ground. We are studying Rabbi Saadia Gaon's Emunot V'Deot, and today we're going to be completing the first treatise, which is going to bring us to the end of Rabbi Saadia's discussion about creation. I'm sure we'll encounter a lot more philosophical questions about God's interaction with our universe, but vis-a-vis specifically creation, this will mark our last chapter. A lot of material to cover, and so we're going to jump right into it. Let me just share my screen so that we have an outline. Okay, so here's what we're talking about today. 9 philosophical questions regarding creation, 9 or so, because I noticed that the Rav David Cohen, who has an amazing commentary, an extensive commentary on Emunot V'Deot, the Nazir, known as the Nazir, has an amazing commentary on Emunot V'Deot, and I thank one of our listeners for pointing that out to me. He says that there are actually 10 questions. So there's different ways of looking at the questions. So anyway, after having presented the Torah's model of creation, and after having presented 12 additional opposing models from other belief systems of his time and refuting them, Rabbi Saadia concludes the treatise on creation with some remaining questions, philosophical questions that his reader may have, and he proceeds to answer them. And this will mark therefore the final chapter of the treatise on creation. And here we'll just go right into it. Question number 1. If everything was created from nothing in time, which is the premise of the Torah's narrative of creation, how could the wise King Solomon pronounce Dor Holech V'Dor Ba, that a generation leaves and a generation comes, another generation comes, meaning the generations are fleeting, but V'ha'aretz le'olam omadet, but the world subsists forever. Now, doesn't that imply an eternal universe? Doesn't that imply that the world has no beginning and no end? This is a question that may sound familiar to some of you because we encountered this question in the Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim in the guide. So we'll get to that shortly. But Reb Saadia's answer is the opposite is to be inferred from this verse. Just pumfakert, as we say in the yeshiva, just the opposite is supposed to be derived from this verse. This, if anything, this verse is indicative of the finiteness of our universe. King Solomon was not declaring that the world is eternal, but was rather demonstrating that the world was created and temporal. What is my proof? That this world is filled with things that come into existence constantly. A generation leaves and a generation comes anew. This is the natural way of the world until its end and is throughout its existence. All the verse is implying is that this world, this reality that we know of, our terrestrial, corporeal reality that we call our universe, our world, whatever you want to call it, is filled with things that are constantly leaving or dying, and then new things come and replace them and come anew. That is the state, that is the steady state of our universe, that things constantly die and fade away, and new things come in their place. What does that prove? This proves that the entire world was created, since anything that contains created things must itself be created. That is the premise. It would make no sense for there to be two different kinds of existence. One is eternal existence and one is temporary existence. And for it's something which is complete eternity to be filled with temporariness. You would expect eternity to be filled with eternal things, and you expect temporariness to be filled with temporary things. That's what Shlomo HaMelech is arguing. The world is filled with temporary things, and therefore our world must not be eternal. It must be temporary, which means it must have come into existence at some point in time. That is the gist of Rabbi Saadia's argument, and that therefore you cannot prove anything from the pasuk. Now, I would like to point out is that out of all of our questions that we're going to see today, this is the only question that is challenged based on a verse in Tanakh. All of the other questions that Rabbi Saadia is going to pose to us are based on logic and philosophical argumentation. And it's quite curious that he puts this first, but he obviously feels that this is an important verse. King Solomon was the wisest of all men, and if he says something, we have to take it seriously because he too presumably was a philosopher. Now, let's go to the Rambam for just a minute. The Rambam, as we all know, we've discussed this many times before, the Rambam was deeply, deeply affected by Rabbi Saadia Gaon. And in many ways, he structures so many of the conversations, the discussions that he has in the guide based on Rabbi Saadia Gaon's Emunot Videyot. And that's why, at least for me, I find it personally edifying that we studied the guide before we studied Emunot Videyot, because it helps us retrace our steps and we get to see what was the Rambam thinking, what was his inspiration for some of the directions that he took the guide. And in so many instances, we see that it was Rabbi Saadia Gaon's Emunot Videyot. The Rambam is therefore aware of Rabbi Saadia's interpretation, and he debates it, maintaining that Solomon is asserting the eternity of the universe, but only a parte post, in contrast to a parte ante. Now, when we studied the guide, we used Shlomo Pine's translation, and he introduced us to these two, I believe they are Latin terms, to describe two different kinds of eternity. There's a parte post, that something will exist for all of eternity, and then there's a parte ante, that something has existed for all of eternity. And the Rambam felt that the two are divisible, which some theologians and philosophers do. They discuss the idea that even though something has an origin point, it can still be eternal in the sense that it continues ad infinitum. And something can have eternally existed without having any beginning, even though it can have an end. Something that is truly eternal from both ends, we would say, is both a parte ante and a parte post. But the Rambam's argument is, and this was a very a controversial statement, and when we learned the guide in section 2, chapter 28, we also made note of the fact that there are a number of Rishonim, a number of medievalists who disagree with the Rambam, but the Rambam maintains that this world is eternal in the sense that once Hashem created it, it will exist for all of eternity. In some way, shape, or form, we'll call that perhaps Olam Haba. We're not going to get into that right now, but let's take a look using Friedlander's open translation. Let's take a look at what the Rambam maintains in that chapter, because remember, the second section of the guide is all about creation. He says, many of our co-religionists thought that King Solomon believed in the eternity of the universe. And of course, which co-religionist is the Rambam referring to? He says many, but I don't know if he's referring to many because many subscribe to Reb Saadia, but certainly the person who originates this idea is Rabbi Saadia, who raises the question, doesn't Solomon seem to be saying that the world will exist forever? This is very strange, the Rambam says. How can we suppose that anyone that adheres to the law of Moses, our teacher, could accept that theory, that there was no beginning? If you believe in the Torah says there was creation, there was a beginning, not that there was eternality. If we were to assume that Solomon has, on this point, God forbid, deviated from the law of Moses, the question would be asked, why did most of the prophets and the sages accept it from him? Why have they not opposed him or blamed him for holding that opinion, as he has been blamed for having married strange women and for other things? In other words, if King Solomon was wrong by suggesting that the universe is eternal, why was he never challenged? So, clearly, this can't be what King Solomon is saying. He can't mean that the world is eternal. The reason why this has been imputed to him is to be found in the following passage. They desired that. Now, this is a statement from the Midrash, not quoting from Kohelet first, but actually quoting from a Midrash that says that Kohelet contains many confusing verses, meaning that if you read it without interpreting it correctly, you could be misled away from Torah ideology. As it says in the Midrash, they desire to suppress the book of Kohelet because its words incline towards skepticism or towards disbelief. It is undoubtedly true that certain passages in this book include, when taken literally, opinions different from those taught in the law, and they must therefore be explained figuratively. A lot a lot of the theodicy passages in Kohelet, why bad things happen to good people, or whether it's better to go to a house of mourning or to a house of mirth. A lot of these things seem to be contradictory, where Solomon contradicts himself in the book of Ecclesiastes. But the theory of the eternity of the universe is not among those opinions. The book does not even contain any passage that implies this theory, much less a passage in which it is clearly set forth. So, the Rambam says, if you think that Shlomo was even suggesting that the world is eternal, you're misreading the book. There are, however, in the book some passages which imply the indestructibility of the universe, a doctrine that is true. Now, what does he mean, the indestructibility of the universe? What he means to say is a parte post. That is to say, once Hashem created the universe from absolute nothing, creatio ex nihilo yesh me'ayin, the world is now indestructible and will exist eternally. And from the fact that the indestructibility of the universe is taught in this book, some persons wrongly inferred that the author believed in the eternity of the universe, i.e., what Pines calls a parte ante. The following are the words that refer to the indestructibility of the universe. Dor holech v'dor ba, v'ha'olam le'olam omadet, and the world and the earth remains forever. Right? He's quoting the exact verse from Rebbe Sadia. But for the Rambam, here's the thing. He has a totally different reading from Rebbe Sadia. Rebbe Sadia understands it in the way that he's going to express. Those who do not agree with me as regards to the above distinction between the indestructibility and the eternity of the universe, meaning a parte post versus a parte ante, are compelled to explain the term le'olam, meaning forever, to mean the time fixed for the existence of the earth. For as how long the earth is standing, that's how Rabbi Sadia understands it, and the verse is not getting into whether the world is eternal or not. For as long as the world is standing, it is filled with temporary creations, things that come and go, and therefore the world is temporary. That's the way Rabbi Sadia reads it. Now, I find it fascinating that the Rambam has a completely different reading. He has dutifully quoted from his teacher, Rebbe Sadia Gaon, without identifying him by name. We talked a little bit about, in the past, when we were learning the guide, why the Rambam doesn't always mention his sources. There are many times when he shows great deference and quotes Rebbe Sadia by name. But I think this is part of him showing respect to Rebbe Sadia. Because he disagrees with Rebbe Sadia and doesn't want to flagrantly disagree with his Rebbe, he doesn't mention him by name. But it's clear, it would seem quite clear, that he is making reference to Rebbe Sadia in Emunot v'Deyot. So that was question number one. Question number two. I promise you they're going to go a little bit faster now. On the assertion of creatio ex nihilo, that God created everything from nothing, how can something come from nothing? The great philosophical question that was the main reason why, said Rebbe Sadia, there were so many other alternate philosophical models, because philosophers could not get their head around the concept that something could be created from nothing, because it's not within the frame of our reference. And so the answer is, if you really want to answer this question correctly, he says the human intellect cannot comprehend this concept. If the human intellect could conceive of creatio ex nihilo, it would not have been necessary for man to ascribe creation to an ultimate being who transcends human intellect, since man is capable of grasping the concept. In other words, the very fact that we acknowledge that there is a supreme being that we call God, who is above human comprehension, whose understanding, ilo machshavotai machshavotechem, the way I think is not the way you think, oh, my creations, is because we know that God is capable of doing things that even the human mind cannot even conceive properly. The very distinction between God and his created beings is God's ability to cognize this concept, since only one, and I'm just inserting perhaps my own understanding or interpretation, since only one who is outside creation has the capacity to cognize the bringing of something out of nothing. If you live in a construct, if you live in a universe where everything always comes from something else, then it's impossible to comprehend how something could come from nothing. But if you're God, who is the creator and therefore outside of this construct, it makes very good sense from God's point of view how something could come from nothing. By asking us to explain how creatio ex nihilo works, such a questioner is expecting us and him to be creators instead of created beings. The very nature of being created means that you are limited in your understanding based on what where God places you within creation. And therefore, just like the nature of our universe is there should always be two sides of the equation of the formation of matter, so that something cannot come from nothing. But that's the nature of our universe. And that's the universe within which we are created. We are part of that existence. And therefore, it's not even possible for us, since we're not outside of this creation construct, to comprehend anything else. We must therefore be content with vaguely contemplating the concept without being able to describe or illustrate it in our minds. And unfortunately, I think that this is a fallback answer. It's not the lichatchila, we would say. It's not the preferred answer to basically say the human mind cannot comprehend certain things. It's only something that Rabbi Sadia feels forced to submit, just like the Rambam in Hilchot Tshuva, where he says, when you come, there are certain concepts that you come to a brick wall because there's a direct contradiction between concepts like determinism and free will. And he says, you just can't understand it. That God's vantage point, it makes very good sense. From the human vantage point, it does not. Rabbi Sadia essentially says the same thing about Creatio ex nihilo. Question number 3. Before this world was created, what existed in its space? So that's a good question, because the premise of the question is that without a universe, something else has to occupy the space that the universe currently occupies. But Reb Sadia's answer is the premise is fallacious, because the questioner is under the false impression that space is something independent of the physical object. That is, every physical object occupies its own space, not an independent entity that precedes it, or what Rosenblatt calls a substrate or a substratum called space. Therefore, in the absence of any physical object, there is no space. Essentially, what Reb Sadia is asking us to understand is, in the absence of created reality, not only is there no physical reality, there's not even a physical space. Physical space is part of that physical reality. Before creation, there is no space whatsoever. And according to the questioner's false reasoning, one will get caught in an infinite loop of what is the space of the space and what is the space of the space of the space ad infinitum. Because you could say, well, what space does the space occupy, right? When one physical object vacates a space, another physical entity occupies that space, such as the revolving planet, where the Western Hemisphere occupies the space where the Eastern Hemisphere previously was. But that's only when you have a physical universe that you're working with. But in the absence of any physical object, including air, space is non-existent. So air is not a complete vacuum. Even a vacuum where there's no molecules or atoms circulating whatsoever is still part of our physical existence. And without anything, without creation at all, there's no such thing as this concept called space, which the questioner thought was something independent of physical reality. Question number 4. Before creation, how was time devoid of all physical objects? And sort of the answer is almost included in the question. What was time like before there were any physical objects? Or could time exist? The assumption being, the premise being, is that, well, if God exists, then time must exist. But how can time exist without space? And the answer is, this person is also working under a false assumption about time. He falsely believes that time exists independent of physicality and that the world is contained within time. But in reality, time is a product of the motions of the physical celestial spheres. Without physicality, there is no time. Now, we don't need to go into the specific concept of, he says that time is a product of the motion of the physical celestial spheres. But basically, his argument is, as Aristotle had argued, and he's basing himself on Aristotle, that time is the number of motion in respect of before and after. Motion, or kinesis as Aristotle called it, cannot exist without a substrate, a body, which must be spatial. Hence, no motion, no time. If there's nothing that's moving in the physical universe, then there is no time. Time is a product of motion, according to Aristotle. We won't go into the deep philosophical analysis of that, but essentially, without space, you have no time. Because without space, there is no motion, and without motion, there is no time. Now, I just wanted to point out, because I find this to be fascinating as an armchair amateur physicist, modern physics agrees with the idea that time and space are inexorably linked. In Einstein's theory of relativity, space and time are inseparably linked into a single entity, which he called space-time. You cannot have time without space, or vice versa. The geometry of space affects the passage of time. So, for example, time dilation in gravitational fields. So as space becomes bendable and distorted in relativity, so too does time. And that's where we get into this idea of time travel and things like that. But not much has changed philosophically, even after the advent of modern physics, because we acknowledge that without space, you cannot have time. And so therefore, the premise of the question is fallacious. It's not what was time like before space. There was no time when there was no space. Question number 6. How can one accept the suggestion that the world is only 4,693 years old? Now, you and I, as we study this, we're in the year 5785, right? So that's in our secular calendar, that's the year 2025. When Sadia writes this, 4693, that's over 1,100 years ago. And he's writing this in the year or just a little bit under 1,100 years ago. He's writing this in the year 933. So as the commentaries point out, Sadia is revealing how old he was when he wrote this. He was about 50 years old when he wrote Emunot V'Deot. So he was not a youngster, but he wasn't yet a really old man, but he definitely had a mature mind to be able to explore these philosophical concepts. So, but the question, of course, is, and it's a very simple question, how do you accept the suggestion that the world is only a few thousand years old when we look around us and it seems like the mountains and the stars and the planets and everything around us seems to be ancient and much older than that? So Rabbi Sadia gives a very simplistic answer, which I believe needs to be developed much further. He says that once we accept that the world was created, it must have had some start date. Even if we existed only 100 years after creation, we would still have to acknowledge creation. All the more so must we acknowledge it now that we exist so many years after that period. And he's not getting into the whole idea of carbon dating. Of course, he doesn't know anything about this idea that you can actually use scientific instrumentation to determine how old something is. Now, the question becomes more accentuated and more problematic when we look at the fact that we have modern carbon dating methods which indicate to us, and through archaeology, it's clear that the world is much older than 5,785 years, and even that there were human beings of some type, because of archaeological evidence and all of the different substrata of geology that exists. The further down we dig, we know that there were dinosaurs, etc. All of this is not part of Rabbi Sadia's question. This is a thought question for Rabbi Sadia, a philosophical question, and his answer is very simple. It may seem to us that the world is ancient, and that's what comes to our eyes. But once we submit to the Torah's narrative of the world was created at one point in time, the date really doesn't make any difference. It could have been yesterday and it could have been 5,000 years ago. It doesn't make a difference. The fact is that there was creation. So people who lived only 100 years after creation also even had a greater dilemma, but the fact is that's the way the Torah narrates it, and therefore we accept it. Now, of course, for us, it's a little bit more complicated than that, because as I pointed out, we have actual scientific evidence that the world is over 5,785 years old. And of course, therefore, we go to various different models of that. Really, that number 5785 is only from the formation of what we call man, i.e. a being imbued with the Tselem Elohim, with the image of God. But clearly, not only were there human type beings before the advent of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, but there were billions of years of existence long before 5785, We know the Big Bang is over 13 billion years old, and so clearly the world is much older than that. But as far as our purposes for the time of creation of human beings, of mankind with the image of God imbued within them, that's the date. Question number 7. Using the premise that nothing preceded creation, and there was absolutely nothing, how can that be? When it comes to human activity, someone who refrains from one activity is really being active nonetheless. In other words, what the premise of the question is that if we look at the world around us, we see that even when someone is dormant and not doing something, they really are doing something. And therefore, the question becomes, if you're telling me that God actually created from absolute nothingness, wasn't God being proactive during that period of nothingness also? In other words, is it really accurate to say that there was absolutely nothing going on and then there was something from absolute nothing? It seems that we're working under the premise, as Rav Kitover explains in his commentary, the Shvil Emunah. If a person refrains from anger, for example, we say that he is being proactively solicitous and kind. Or if a person refrains from hatred, he is proactively exercising love. You can't be completely zero. You can't be completely nothing. Even when I'm sleeping, I'm proactively sleeping. Even when I am, let's say, sitting and just staring into space, I'm being contemplative. I'm doing something. So therefore, accordingly, the question is, even before God created our reality, he must have been proactively doing something, so that we really cannot correctly state that our world was born from nothing. So the answer that Rav Kitover gives is that, again, you're comparing apples and oranges. You're comparing the human experience with the divine. This question is based on human perception, but humans are innately different from God, in that all human attributes are extrinsic to the human being, and therefore the human being is always attached to some kind of external attribute. There's never such a thing as a human being with zero attributes, just like you cannot have matter without form. There is always going to be something that is attributable to the human being. He's either awake or he's sleeping, he's alive or he's dead, he's angry or he's solicitous, or he's happy or he's sad, etc., etc. By contrast, God's attributes and behavior are intrinsic to him, and as such are unlike the human counterpart. And therefore, when we say that God created, he was a creator, before God was a creator, he was nothing. Not that he was something that is the opposite of being a creator. When we say that God created our physical reality, it is not that he refrained from some other activity that he was engaged in before that, since there is no opposite to the act of creation. Rather, before God created, there was absolutely no activity or thing that we would say was the opposite of creation that God was engaging in. Okay, so that's just the question. You may argue it's semantics, but it's more than that. It's that, as the Rambam had pointed out to us, God does not have any intrinsic attributes. Remember, the Rambam had developed this idea even further by talking about the negative theology of God. You can only describe in terms of what he is not versus what he is. And perhaps when we go into the second treatise about a description of God and his unity, we will develop this idea further. But let's go on to question number 8. We have 2 more questions and then we'll be done for today. Question number 8. Why did God create anything? What was his objective? Why did Hashem create? What did he need it? If God, and of course, to add or to amplify the question, if to augment the question, if God is completely perfect and lacking for nothing, he is completely the ultimately perfect being, what does he gain out of creation and what is the benefit for creation? So we offer 3 answers, says Rabbi Sadja. Answer number 1, vis-a-vis, there really was no reason for God's act of creation. And you cannot question God and say that God must have been motivated by something. Vis-a-vis God, this is not considered doing something for naught, as it would be if a human being did something for no reason. If I decide to pick up a rock and throw it into the air, and I can't think of a reason why I did that, then we would say that what I did was nonsensical, that it doesn't make any sense, and I'm not a logical being who does only logical things. But that's not the way that we describe God. God will sometimes do things that have no purpose, have no objective. This is because when we say humans act for no reason, it is because they do not know what benefit that action serves. Humans normally do not act without any known benefit. God, however, never acts with a benefit in mind, since God is elevated above all benefit and thus never acts with benefit or purpose in mind. Because anytime you assign purpose to a person's actions, you're saying, in a sense, that person is lacking until he does that thing. Like, so for example, if I decide to pick up my cup of coffee and take a sip, it's probably because I was lacking sufficient saliva in my mouth, or I was thirsty, or I needed to wake up, or whatever my motivation was. But implicit in that statement is the suggestion that I am in some way deficient until I do the act which fulfills a purpose and now makes me more than what I was or whatever I was lacking before I did that action. That cannot be said about God, because since God is ultimately perfect, anything that he does cannot be assigned with purpose, because in and of itself, that's a contradiction to God's perfection. Now, we do want to point out, and we're going to quote two more passages from the Rambam today before we finish. Both of them are from the guide, section 3, chapter 13, and we certainly recommend a full review of that chapter in order to get a more robust taste of the comparisons and contrasts between Rabbi Sadia and the Rambam in this regard. So first of all, he says, the Rambam, at the very beginning of chapter 13 in the third section of the guide, he says, intelligent persons are much perplexed when they inquire into the purpose of creation. I will now show how absurd this question is according to each one of the different theories above mentioned as to why God created the universe. An agent that acts with intention must have a certain ulterior object in that which he performs. Like, what is my objective? This is evident, and no philosophical proof is required. It is likewise evident that which is produced with intent has passed over from non-existence to existence. It is further evident, and generally agreed upon, that the being which has absolute existence, which has never been and will never be without existence, i.e. God, is not in need of an agent, of anything that causes him to exist. There is nothing upon which God is dependent. We have explained this before. The question, what is the purpose thereof, cannot be asked about anything which is not the product of an agent. Therefore, we cannot ask, what is the purpose of the existence of God? Why does God exist? He has not been created, and therefore you cannot say that he has a purpose, because there was nothing that brought God into being that we should say that there was a reason why God exists. According to these propositions, which address the existence of God, it is clear that the purpose is sought for everything produced intentionally by an intelligent cause. That is to say, a final cause must exist for everything that owes its existence to an intelligent being, and the universe does also. But for that which is without a beginning, a final cause need not be sought, as has been stated by us. After this explanation, you will understand that there is no occasion to seek the final cause of the whole universe, because essentially what the Rambam is trying to suggest is that because God has no agency, God can also bring other things into existence without agency also, or without them necessarily having a purpose. Because God has no purpose that we can ascribe to him, anything that God does also has no purpose. So in many ways, as you go through this chapter 13 of the guide, you will see that he suggests very similar ideas. So that's answer number one. It's a fallacy to even question, why did God do X? God doesn't need a reason. God doesn't possess a reason, because even suggesting that there is a reason means that in some way God is deficient or comes into being for a purpose. Okay, let us go on. Answer number two. God sought to demonstrate and reveal his wisdom. Answer number two is not as mysterious as answer number one. Answer number one is the whole concept, the whole premise of asking what was God's objective is a fallacious premise. Answer number two is, let us go with the idea that there is a premise with the premise that there is a purpose for creation. What was that purpose? God sought to demonstrate and reveal his wisdom. As it says in Psalms and Tehillim, Lahodia livnei ha'adam gevurotav uchvod hadar malchuto, straight out of the Ashrei, that God's objective is to inform mankind of his might and the glory of the beauty of his kingdom. God wishes to share of his glory with his creations. And to do that, in order to fill the world with a knowledge of God, there has to be a world. And although this is still mysterious, Rabbi Sadia says, I guess it's not as mysterious as the first answer, which says you can't even have a premise that says that God has a purpose or an objective in creation. But this one, it says, yes, on some human level, we could say that God does have an objective because he informs us of such in Sefer Tehillim. Now, I don't think that answer number 2 is necessarily arguing with answer number 1. If answer number 1 is correct, then Rabbi Sadia should have stopped just there without giving answer number 2 and answer number 3. But I do believe that perhaps what he's doing is that he's trying to offer different answers from different perspectives. The true philosopher will be satisfied with answer number 1. But as we know, there are many passages that are contained in Tanakh that don't work with philosophical premises, such as this verse from Ashrei. And therefore, that's what Reb Sadia is basically saying. He's saying that Hashem wants us to be able to have an understanding of him to some degree, and he therefore wants us to relate to him as a being of volition who does things with intent. And as such, he revealed to us in Tanakh what his intent was in bringing us all into creation. He wanted to share his wisdom and glory with his creations. And finally, answer number 3, which is related, again, working with the same kind of premise that we're not speaking to a philosopher, but we're speaking to a person whom God wishes to engage with and to have some kind of understanding of God on some more, let's say, anthropomorphic level. God sought to bring benefit to his creations by guiding them through his commandments, enabling them thereby to receive benefit. So it's not only that God wishes to share his wisdom with mankind, but God wants to bring benefit to mankind. Slightly different, meaning that this is even more, let's say, shall we say, simplistic or more fundamental to the human understanding, because even, let's say, a person is not wise and does not have that sense of intellectual aspiration. But everyone, even people who are, let's say, of a lower class of intellectual being, will understand the idea of schar va'onesh, the idea of reward and punishment. And so therefore, this is what answer number 3 is for a person who really is looking for, just like the meat and potatoes, the black and white. Why did Hashem make me? The answer is Hashem loves you. He wants to share goodness with you. He wants to give you greatness. And thus it says in Isaiah, Ko Amar Hashem Go Alcha Kedosh Yisrael, so says God, who is your Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. Ani Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God, Milamedcha Lehoil. Everything that I instruct you is for your benefit. Madrichacha B'derech Telech, I instruct you how to live your life. And through, therefore, a regimen of Torah and mitzvot that God provided for us, and through man's accomplishment of that call to serve God and to follow his Torah, man will receive great reward in the world to come, and sometimes in this world as well. And that is why God created us, so that he could Ratza HaKadosh Baruch Hu lezakot et Israel, as it says in the final Mishnah in Tractate Makot. God wanted to bring merit to the Jewish people. Lefichach hirba lahem Torah u'mitzvot, and that's for that reason he gave us commandments in the Torah that are very, very numerous, so that the more we do, the more we serve God, the more benefit we receive. So again, 3 different answers, 3 different perhaps audiences for these 3 different answers, going from the most sophisticated philosopher to the most simplistic minded person, because perhaps Rabbi Sadia feels this question is going to be answered by all strata of the Jewish community, the learned and unlearned alike, and therefore he needs to provide three answers. Now, the Rambam is also engages in this discussion, but he's bothered by this answer. And he says in the very same chapter, chapter 13 of the third section of the guide, even if the universe existed for man's sake and man existed for the purpose of serving God, as has been mentioned, the question still remains, what is the end of serving God? Why does God want us to serve him? He does not become more perfect if all his creatures serve him and comprehend him as far as possible, nor would he lose anything if nothing existed beside him. God is perfect, so why does God create? It might perhaps be replied that the service of God is not intended for God's perfection, it is intended for our own perfection. It is good for us, it makes us perfect. But then the question might be repeated. What is the object of our being perfect? Why did God create us? What is the necessity for human beings to achieve perfection? Why? We must, in continuing the inquiry as to the purpose of the creation, at last arrive at the answer, it was the will of God, or his wisdom decreed it, and this is the correct answer. The wise men in Israel have therefore introduced in our prayers the following passage in the Ne'ilah prayer: you have distinguished man from the beginning and chosen him to stand before thee. Who can say unto thee, what dost thou? And if he be righteous, what does he give you? They have thus clearly stated that it was not a final cause that determined the existence of all things, but only his will. According to Rav Kitover, the Rambam really is not disagreeing with Rabbi Sadia. Really, I think all he's saying is, because the audience of the guide is the first person, the philosopher, the Rambam is basically saying, yes, Rabbi Sadia provides two other answers that sort of depict God as doing this for our sake. But why? Why do we need to exist? Why does he want us to have goodness? So what? And then what? What's the end game? So what? What does that mean? How does that affect the cosmos? And we really don't understand. And therefore, the only answer that we can give is that it is God's will. And the Rabbi Sadia's point is that even to say that God has a will is somewhat of an incorrect way of using language, because God is not a being of volition at all. And finally, question number 9, which we'll do quite quickly, based on the above that creation has purpose, why did not create our reality any earlier than he did? Why did God decide to create 5,785 years ago and not create us 10,000 years ago, or 20,000 years ago, or 1,000,000 years ago, or 1,000,000,000? Or why did he create us 5,000 years and not 2,000 years ago? So this question is, again, predicated on the idea that time exists independently of creation. And so Rabbi Sadia gives a very basic answer once again. As we explained, he actually gives two answers to this question. Answer number 1, as we explained, there was no time before creation. It is therefore absurd to ask a question in terms of before or earlier than creation, because there is no time. So that's number 1. You can't say, as a matter of fact, a number of the commentaries point out that this is really what the Mishnah in Chagiga is suggesting when it says that a person has no right to inquire as what existed before or what existed above, meaning that it's a futile exercise for the human mind to try and discover what predates creation, because predating or existing before is a sentence that employs words that are chronological in nature. And if time doesn't even exist before creation, then we're using the wrong nomenclature to describe pre-creation. And it's not a concept, therefore, that the human mind has even the capacity to explore. And so that's answer number 1. If you're a philosopher, you recognize that this is an absurd question, and and there's no way to even discuss it. Answer number 2, again, perhaps more simplistic, it is the way of every volitional being with free will to act at the time of his choosing. And as Rav Kitover, I think, explains, thus any moment when God chose to create would be subject to that question, or no moment of God's choosing would be subject to that question, because in order to display his free will, God chose a time of his choosing. Meaning that any being of free will who wishes to display that I am a volitional being must choose something, even if it seems arbitrary to everybody else. It is at least demonstrative of that being's free will to choose at his whim. And therefore, regardless of how we're going to answer that question, God had to choose a specific time, and therefore he chose that he demonstrated his free will by choosing one specific time other than another. And according to Rav Kitover, the Rambam also addresses this question in a similar way, and he suggests that the Rambam and Rabbi Sadia are identical. We'll just read a few lines from it because we're really running out of time. He says the Rambam is describing how we can prove that the universe is not eternal, like Aristotle had argued. But first, he tries to bring in to cite Aristotle's proofs for the eternality of the universe. And he writes in section 2 of the guide, chapter 18, the second method employed in proving the eternity of the universe is based on the theory that all wants, changes, and obstacles are absent from the essence of God. God is not a volitional being. You cannot say that he has a purpose or that he has a desire to do something, because that implies an imperfection before that desire is implemented. Our refutation of this proof, which is both difficult and profound, is this. Every being that is endowed with free will and performs certain acts in reference to another being necessarily interrupts those acts at one time or another in consequence of some obstacles or changes. But that's only from a human perspective. So thus changed circumstances changes will, and the will, when it meets with obstacles, is not carried into effect. This, however, is only the case when the causes of the actions are external. But when the action has no other purpose whatever than only to fulfill the will, then the will does not depend on the existence of favorable circumstances. In other words, what the Rambam is essentially saying, more in line with what we said before, that God is not a volitional being, is that you cannot even question why God created, because the why implicit in the asking why is what is the purpose. God has no purpose, God has no antecedents or agents, and therefore God's decision to create has no antecedents or drives either, or purpose or cause either. And therefore the question becomes an absurd question. And the same thing is true as saying, why did God create at one time and not at another time? So Rav Kitover thinks that the Rambam and Rabbi Sadia are perfectly aligned in this regard. I'm not 100% convinced, but I'll take his word for it for today. And that brings us to the end of chapter 4 and the end of the entire treatise on creation. So before we recess for today, are there any questions or comments before I let you go? Let me also remind you all that we will not be meeting for the rest of August because of my travels. We will resume, God willing, at the beginning of September, and I'll send you out the date when that date is verified. It should be, I think, either the first or second Monday in September. Questions, comments before we break for today?
Rabbi Korobkin.
Thank you, and have a safe
Sorry. One at a time. I'm sorry. Who would like to speak? I see Tehila.
And have a safe summer.
Oh, thank you. The same to you. Thank you so much. Dimpy, what would you like to say?
Yeah, sorry. I just had a quick question of your opinion on something. Do you think it would be fair to say that the Rambam's guide is really then, if not in explicit dialogue with this book, at least a response to it?
In many ways it is. The Rambam, I believe, is using certainly the very same methodology of Rabbi Sadia, but he also takes great issue with it, especially because he feels that Rabbi Sadia, especially if you go towards the end of the first part of the guide, which we're not going to go into today, but the Rambam felt that Rabbi Sadia was incorrectly influenced by the Kalamists of his time, which was a certain type of philosophy that the Rambam strongly disagreed with, especially atomism, which Rabbi Sadia seems to have subscribed to, and the Rambam felt was wrong because it was anti-Aristotelian. But the methodology, the worldview, the Weltanschauung of Rabbi Sadia is the same as the Rambam. And he wishes to, like you said, engage in dialogue with it by correcting the mistakes of Rabbi Sadia and building upon all of the correct things that Rabbi Sadia said. Okay?
Thank you.
All right. Have a great rest of the summer, everybody. Thank you for letting me schlep on and discuss this book, which for many people I think is probably very dry and uninspiring. But thank you for being part of it, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you very much.